Hello, life groups. We're continuing with our series, digging into aspects of the Bible and certainly stories around Jesus. And I've got one of my favorite stories about Jesus, and it comes from the book of Matthew. The same story is also found in the book of Mark and the book of Luke. So you can cross-reference this kind of stuff to kind of get a fuller picture of what's going on. But I'm going to be reading from Matthew chapter 9, verse 18 to 26. As Jesus was saying this, the leader of a synagogue came and knelt before him. "My daughter has just died," he said, "but you can bring her back to life again if you just come and lay your hand on her." So Jesus and his disciples got up and went with him. Just then, a woman who had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding came up behind him. She touched the fringe of his robe, for she thought, "If I can just touch his robe, I will be healed." Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, "Daughter, be encouraged. Your faith has made you well." And the woman was healed at that moment. This is a remarkable story about Jesus, and what I'm going to do now in terms of explanation is I actually want to put Jesus in his own context. And so often we forget that Jesus was a first century Jewish man. He lived in a Jewish world. He lived really in the world, a religious climate created by the Old Testament and God's dealings with Israel. And so the happenings that happened around Jesus didn't just happen in isolation and a vacuum. It happened in a rich culture of the day. And sometimes when we understand aspects of that culture, it actually helps us understand Jesus. And so I want to go into some of the behind the scenes of what happened in this event for us to see and understand a little bit about what was happening. So the first thing is that Jesus had just come from somewhere. In the book of Mark, it said he actually came from the other side of the lake. So he's ministering. He just gets back. As he gets onto shore, this leader of a synagogue comes up to him and says, "My daughter's just died. Can you come and raise her from the dead?" And Jesus is like, "Yeah, let's go. We're going there." So they're on a mission. Jesus and his disciples, they're missioning off to this synagogue leader's house. And at that moment, this woman who's had this issue of bleeding for 12 years, it says that she came up behind him and she grabbed the hem of his garment or the edge of his robe. In different ways it's translated. And so I just want to unpack that a little bit. The first thing it says is that she had an issue of blood or bleeding, and she had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, for anyone, if you're bleeding for 12 years, that's inconvenient. But within the Jewish world, the religious world created by the Old Testament rules and regulations, this was really serious for her. And I'm actually going to read from the Old Testament, from the book of Leviticus, where God gave a command about this. And you've got to remember that the law is a foreshadow. It's teaching the people about the reality that will come about in the new dispensation or the new covenant when Jesus Christ comes. But this is the command that God gave. So it says this from verse 25, Leviticus 15, verse 25. "If a woman has a flow of blood for many days that is unrelated to her menstrual period, or if the blood continues beyond the normal period, she is ceremonially unclean. As during her menstrual period, the woman will be unclean as long as the discharge continues. Any bed she lies on and any object she sits on during that time will be unclean, just as during her normal menstrual period. If any of you touch these things, you will be ceremonially unclean. You must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening." Throughout the Old Testament laws, there was this issue of cleanness and uncleanness. And the whole idea is that only those who are clean, and that's morally clean, ceremonially clean, ritually clean, clean regarding the clothes you wear, the food you eat, in other words, complete perfection, can be in the presence of God, can come to the temple and partake in religious life. And this woman, on account of her issue of bleeding, meaning that there was something wrong with her, there was a default, a messed up part of her body, it actually kept her from being perfect, which means she couldn't be in the presence of God. And not only that, everything she touches is unclean. And so you've got this case of this unclean woman who basically has lived a secluded life. One of the passages, it says that she had been sick for 12 years and she'd spent all her money on doctors, and rather than getting better, she'd actually got worse. And so there's this woman who's cut off from friends and family. She's lived this life of uncleanness. She's now broke. I mean, in so many ways, her life is a picture of being destitute and being without the fullness of what God's life has for her. And in so many ways, we can relate to that. Not the issue of sickness in our bodies, although many of us are sick. It's just this sense in which we're just not quite clean. We're just not quite whole. There's these issues in us that, man, we just wish we could get over. We could just wish we could heal. And we feel like it separates us from God. And the amazing thing is that this woman came up and she reached out to Jesus. And it actually says in the story in the Gospels that she grabbed or she laid hold of the hem of his garment. Now, this is a little bit strange for us. And, we're not quite sure what to make of it. But I just want to explain a little bit about what the hem of the garment means here. So in the book in Numbers, chapter 15, verse 37 to 39, it says this: Then the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. Throughout the generations to come, you must make tassels for the hems of your clothes and attach them with a blue cord. When you see the tassels, you will remember and obey all the commands of the Lord instead of following your own desires and defiling yourselves as you are prone to. And so the men of Israel were instructed to have hems or tassels on the corners of their garments. And to this day in Israel, Jewish men will walk around and they'll either have tassels poking out from beneath their shirt, or they'll wear a prayer shawl, and on the end of that will be these tassels. Why? Because God commanded them to do it. And those tassels were there to remind them of the laws. And the people of Israel actually knot 613 knots in those tassels in the four corners. So they remind them of the 613 commandments of God. And for men, this was a symbol of a person's authority. It was the idea that as a man, your authority comes from God and comes from the law of God because He's bestowed it on people. And so what's amazing is that these people were wearing this. Now, Jesus obviously was wearing it. That's why she came out and she grabbed the hem or the edge of his garment, the edge of his robe. He was wearing this traditional prayer shawl that Jewish men would wear. And so when we picture Jesus in our mind's eye, we've got to picture him as a Jewish man that lived within a Jewish world. And you've got to ask the question, why did she lay hold of that tassel? Why did she grab that? In the book of Malachi, in chapter 4 and verse 2, it says that when the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N, is a symbol of the Messiah, the Son of Righteousness is risen, he shall come with healing in his wings. Now that's a very strange picture. There's Jesus the Rabbi, Jesus the Messiah with healing in his wings. It's like, well, Jesus doesn't have wings. But the same Hebrew word translated wings is the same Hebrew word for the word tassels from the passage in Numbers that we just read. And the reality is, it says that he shall come with healing in his tassels, in the hem of his garment. And so this woman, being a good Jewish woman, knew the promise of Malachi, that when the Messiah comes, he'll have healing in the edge of his garment, in the tassels of his garment. And so when she sneaked up behind him all sneakily, and she grabbed hold of the hem of the garment, what she was doing is she was grabbing hold of a promise of God. And you can imagine for her what she was risking here. For her, she was risking making him ceremonially unclean. Remember that anything that she touched became unclean. And so it's almost like he's going to become unclean. She's risking public punishment and being exposed publicly. Like, hey, aren't you the woman with the issue of the flow of blood? Who dare you come out to your house? Who dare you to come up to this righteous man and grab the hem of her garment? And she was just like, I don't care. I'm so desperate. I need hope. And there was this promise in Malachi that the Son of Righteousness, that this Messiah would come, he'd have healing in his tassels and the edge of his garments. And she leaves her home and she walks to come find this man. Can you imagine the fear that she's feeling? The sense of, man, I'm risking everything for this. And she sneaks up behind him and she goes, man, this is the promise of God. And she lays hold of the hem of his garment, and Jesus turns around and he says, woman, your faith has made you well. You're healed as a response to your faith. And there's this remarkable story of a woman reaching out in faith and Jesus healing her. And what I love about this is that the mission of Jesus and his disciples in that moment was to go meet the synagogue ruler and raise his daughter from the dead, which he goes and does afterward. And there's just this little interlude, this unplanned interlude. Jesus hadn't planned this, but she had. And in a sense, I believe the Spirit of God directed her to Jesus that day because she knew she could find healing there. And the question for you is, what are the things in your life that leave you feeling unclean? What are the issues of your life which leave you feeling like, man, I just can't come to God. I'm disqualified from coming to Him. I'm disqualified from coming into His presence, just like the issue of her bleeding disqualified her from being in the presence of God. What are the things that make you feel disqualified from being in the presence of God? And here's the great news. There's so much more grace in Jesus, and there's healing in Jesus. What is an area of your life you'd love to see His healing in, and what stops you from reaching out? I don't know about you, but I find myself so often knowing that God's good, but struggling to come to Him because I feel like, man, my issues, my brokenness, my sin is just this thing that separates me from Him. And the truth is that is not true. That's a lie. The truth is that we're righteous, that we're perfect in His sight. If our faith is in Jesus, we're perfect. And the amazing thing is that we can always, always, always find healing in Jesus. So why don't you have a discussion about really the things in your life which Jesus has qualified you for and how you can come to Him and find healing.